The AAOS Bone Beat Orthopedic Podcast channel is pleased to welcome you to the latest episode of the AAOS Now podcast. This monthly podcast series covers a broad range of topics to help orthopedic surgeons stay informed, enhance their practices, and provide the best possible care for their patients.
Hello, I'm Robert Orfaly, a member of the editorial board of AAOS Now and your host for this podcast. With me today is Dr. Bopha Chrea, who is an assistant professor at the Carver School of Medicine in Iowa and an assistant professor in the Department of Orthopaedics and Rehabilitation. Bopha, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your story on this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, your family story is at the same time both heartbreaking and uplifting, and I think that's why it's so important that you share this with others. So why don't you simply begin and tell your story of your parents' journey and ultimately your journey?
Sure. So I was born in Thailand in a refugee camp, but the story starts much earlier than that. My parents grew up at a time when the Khmer Rouge, which was a communist regime that took over Cambodia around 1975. They were young teenagers at the time. They survived the Khmer Rouge, which was a regime who basically was run by a dictator named Pol Pot, and he felt that the country should be purified of all foreign influence and took the people to the year zero. So he abolished money. Everyone went to the fields, the rice fields, to work. They survived that when close to a third of the country underwent genocide, died from either malnourishment or disease or torture. They survived that, and then I think your reference is to kind of the journey that brought them to Canada and what influenced me in my development came after, without alluding to too much more. I know we're going to talk about that. So yeah, that's how my family story was, and has had a really profound impact on me.
Absolutely. And I think you begin by talking about, what might be perceived as misfortune and how that can turn around. And I remember, the story of the glasses. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, so my dad, you have kids, so you'd know they're prone to losing things. Mm-hmm. So my dad was about 11 at the time. He grew up in a not a well-off family, but they were fine. He had glasses, which meant that he could read, and which meant also that his family had enough money to afford glasses. And he was playing with his friends on the soccer field. He left them by the side while he was playing. And what at the time was a big deal, because he couldn't see, he couldn't read, and his family couldn't afford to, buy them too frequently, was really a positive thing for him. Because shortly after, they had their house burned down, which was very tragic for them. All their assets, everything was gone. But very shortly after, Pol Pot came into the countryside, which is where they lived, and started taking over. So under his rule, anyone of wealth, anyone educated, meant that they could resist the regime. So they were seen as adversarial, and they were eliminated, either taken to torture camps or immediately murdered. And so for my father and his family, what seemed like a terrible event for them, a sequence of events that led up, he lost his glasses, they lost everything they owned, it actually meant that on paper, they looked very poor. Mm-hmm. And so when the regime took over, that was very positive for them. And so my dad attributes a lot of that to why he was actually able to survive. And so, I talk about sometimes opportunities are disguised as misfortune. Sometimes we see things that we think are bad events, bad life events, or something that has happened to us that is unfavorable, when in fact, it may be disguised. It may be something greater that leads you on a path that maybe you weren't going to take, or maybe something that kind of lets you pivot in a way that is greater than where you were going in the first place.
Absolutely. And that's something that you can relate to everyday life, beyond the dramatic events of your family, right? The second lesson that you offer in your family story is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I know many people doing these podcasts feel uncomfortable. I know I did the first time that I was doing this. So I guess it's apropos on a moment like this. But why don't you tell me a little bit about how the story continues in getting comfortable with the uncomfortable?
Yeah, that's a great example for me. So, for example, residency. Residency is a lot of being comfortable, being uncomfortable. What I mean by that is that, so in the context of my father and our family, around 1979, they realized that the life that they were living in Cambodia, they had just survived the killing fields. My mom and dad had just gotten married. They just had my two brothers. There was so much poverty, so much danger. They realized that this was not somewhere where they could raise their family, or at least give them what they had wanted for them. And so it was very illegal to leave, but they had heard rumors that in Thailand, people were getting to go to the US or Canada or Europe, and they had heard these rumors, so my dad had devised a plan over months so that it wasn't detectable, and moved from village to village. So every month they picked up and they moved village to village, trying to be undetected. He would send a courier to scout the area, and then he'd come back and get my mom and us, and then we would move until they got close enough to the border. They paid someone that night, they went across, and then they got to the refugee camp that I was inevitably born at. And the point there is that there were so many people that resisted that idea, told them, this is really dangerous, you have a young family, how are you gonna do this? Who, when they're 17 or 18,
right,
thinks of, I'm gonna escape a country, I'm gonna figure out a way to navigate or plot my path through a war-torn area, which was how he felt. But even if you don't know where you're going, even if you don't know how you're gonna get there, you haven't mapped it out, as long as you can get comfortable being uncomfortable, navigating the scenario, figuring your way out as you go, you'll get there. The issue is the paralysis of being so scared to start the journey that you just don't start. And that was the case for so many people. So the case for so many people that were just too scared to start that path. And I akin that to residency. I mean, when you start residency, there's a start point and then there's an end point. Right. How you navigate the in-between is entirely up to you and very uncertain. And so I remember when I was a young resident, I asked my chief resident, what if I'm not good? What happens if I'm not the surgeon that I want to be? And his answer was very simple. He just said, I'm going to be good. I'm going to make myself good. That is not an option for me. I'll either operate more or I'll study more or whatever it is that makes me good, gets me there. And that really helped me navigate through my residency.
Absolutely. So that clarity of goal.
Yes, it doesn't matter if you don't know how you're going to get there exactly, or the path, you can't chart it out exactly. As long as you can put yourself in scenarios, get comfortable being uncomfortable to growth, because growth is uncomfortable for so many reasons, you'll get there, as long as you have a clarity of your vision of what you want.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's pick up on that and just complete that thought. Obviously, your family's experiences were extraordinary, but this concept of having a vision and working towards it, even though there's a world of uncertainties of how you're going to get there, how do you use it if, say, a resident or someone else comes to you and asks for advice? Do you kind of try to give them tangible advice? Do you share your story? How do you use that background to help them see their way and how to focus on a vision?
That's a great question. In those scenarios, I think so much of it is meeting the learner where they are and who they are and what they need. Some learners, they need tangible items, goals, a series of goals that they work towards. That there's this effect, the Zorro effect that I read about, and I think about often how accomplishing small tasks, little goals, get you to the end product, build confidence along the way. And for some learners, that's what you need, little tangible items that give them stepping stones to building their confidence or what it is you're striving for. And then for others, it's allowing them to think of what they need, but guiding them, prompting them with questions, prompting them with thoughts that allow them to get there themselves. So I think a lot of it is just meeting the learner where they need to be, where you need to be for them, where they need to be, and then guiding them along that journey. Everyone's different in what they need.
Absolutely. And I imagine even yourself, you're still very early in your career, still a lot to accomplish yet. Do you reflect on your family story, on the lessons that you've just talked about, on plotting your course, a few years in advance and kind of having some visualization of where you would want to be in a few years? So on that point, I think what my parents did for us
really for us, has had a huge impact on my development as a person more than anything. I often draw back to it when I have goals, career aspirations or goals. I draw on them when times are tough or challenging scenarios. But more than anything, honestly, it's the way I approach life. I think back to what they didn't have, what they had to do to get to where they are, and it makes me feel so grateful in my day-to-day life, and really helps me practice gratitude for everything that I have. The basics, food, clothing, shelter, and everything else beyond that is just gravy.
And I think that you just touched on what I believe you've spoken to being your third lesson, which is that gratitude is a superpower. And I love that statement. So why don't you expand on your concept of that?
So, when I spoke to my brothers, we have had this big family experience, but I know what I learned from it, but I wanted to know what they learned from it. My oldest brother, said something to me that has stayed with me for a very long time, which was that, when they were in the camp, the pirates would come down, they'd come loot the camp at night. He had learned from my dad, if you hear screams, grab my younger brother and hide in the false walls, which was where they were for a really long time. And he said, even despite that, to the outsider perspective, that seems like a pretty traumatic experience, maybe pretty negative. He saw that time in their lives as maybe one of the best times he's ever had, because when they were at the camps, all that mattered was us being safe. They would play soccer. And so there's this concept of gratitude giving you an advantage. There are so many factors in life that are so uncontrollable. There's one thing always though, and that's your mindset. And so how you perceive events, how you perceive conflict or challenges, that's completely controllable to you. And if you can flip the switch and see it as either being grateful for an opportunity to learn, grateful for a chance to, I've had scenarios where I think, it'd been so much easier had I not done this, or I did what I felt was the right thing or the hard thing. It'd been so much easier to sit back and not do those things. Right. I think I'm grateful because they gave me a chance to flex or develop a muscle I didn't have before. And I think if you can flip the switch on that, it helps you get through life, the tough times. The tough times aren't necessarily the bad times. They're actually the times that really help you develop and help you grow and become strong. And so I think gratitude is a superpower because it helps you see things in a lens that you might not have seen them before.
And I think one important point I'm hearing is that there has to be an intentionality about it. That, it's sort of like, I remember hearing a study that if you simply smile, even if you don't feel happy, your mood elevates. And so even if you're at a point where you don't really feel a lot of gratitude in you, if you have that intentionality of trying to think about that, it can actually change your perspective.
Absolutely, and then that's not to say, there are times when this sucks. This really sucks. I hate this. It's okay to feel that way. I feel that way all the time, But then I try very hard consciously to tell myself, yeah, but what is the positive here? Where is the following up? Where is the opportunity to learn? Absolutely. Or grow or develop? The one I usually like to frame in my head is the flexing a muscle. I just developed a muscle I didn't have before. Those help me through really, crummy times or something where I think, this sucks.
And working out is tough. And so it's like you say, the hard times are not always the bad times. And I think we often come through that. Certainly with learners, you're dealing with people who are going often through some of the more difficult times in their lives, and you have to kind of guide them through.
Residency is so hard. Residency is some of the toughest years I think that any orthopedic surgeon encounters or has to navigate. So yeah, absolutely. It's a really hard time in your career. And as are the first few years of practice. I think that's something that we don't talk about quite as often, but those first few years are really challenging as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think it speaks volumes that even in this lesson of gratitude, you give the credit to your brother. It shows that you really look at what you've learned from others and help pass that forward to others.
I have had so many people help me and push me up and lift me up, and it's my turn to do the same for others. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to maybe even positively impact one person. But yeah.
Absolutely. So I think just so we all know how the story ended, obviously you're here with us today, But take us through then the conclusion of your parents' story in their journey from Cambodia ultimately to Canada and then your arrival here.
Yeah, so I think where I left off, 1979, around that time, my dad had strategized a way to get close to the border. Once they crossed, the Red Cross had a number of camps in Thailand. They landed at Khao-i-Dang camp, but they were illegal. So it didn't mean that it was smooth sailing from there. I often think actually the journey started again there, and the challenges started again. For about 2 years, they hid in the camp. I credit my dad. He was high school educated, but so smart. He realized that people were leaving the camp who weren't legal status, and they were never coming back. So that's why it took so long for him to get legal status and come out of hiding in the camps. There's about 2 years. Once they got legal status, they had me. So that was where I was born. And then shortly after, they were fortunate. They got permission to leave. This is a tangential story and funny, or I shouldn't say funny, but it is a tangential story. I got really sick when that happened, really sick, and no one knew what was wrong with me. But my dad realized that if they didn't take the opportunity now, maybe it never would come again, or maybe they would wait and maybe something would change. So they got me on the plane, very sick, and we actually had to get off in London and stay there for a week at one of the hospitals. And we got back on shortly after, came to Canada. My mom and dad figured out a way to get jobs, and then they raised us. The three of us are all university educated, thanks to my parents and everything they did. And then I made the decision to go into medicine. There are a lot of factors that influenced my decision to go into medicine. When I was younger, my mom didn't speak any English, or very little. And I remember going to the doctor with her a lot and trying to translate very complex jargon for like a 9-year-old. And I remember this one encounter, and the physician was pretty impatient, with that aspect. And I remember thinking, when I'm an adult, this will be different for me. And I don't know. From there, I loved science. I wanted to do something really positive and impactful in the community and in my life. With healthcare, navigating that system as a really young child probably had a bigger impact on me than I realized it did. I loved science. I fell in love with the science of medicine, and very quickly after, easily fell in love with orthopedics, which I think is the best of all the specialties. Of course, I'm a little inherently biased, but yeah.
We all are here.
Yeah. But those are some factors that really led me to pursuing a career in medicine.
Isn't that amazing? As we finish up, any kind of overarching message? I think the message has already been so powerful, and I really appreciate it. Anything more that you would want someone listening to really think about tomorrow as they're walking to work, or they're having a quiet moment, to really reflect on your story and sort of the message of how to grow and use gratitude to find their vision and work towards it?
One thing that brings me a lot of happiness and joy sometimes when I sit down and think about it, I'll reach out to a mentor, someone who's helped me, guide me, a voice, a shoulder, and I'll thank them. I read a study about it actually from Harvard. But I'll just reach out to them and I'll thank them. I'll send them a private message and just outline what they've done, for me, or even if it was some advice or a case they helped me on or anything. And I think that actually really positively sets you in a mindset where you realize, how fortunate you are, and it spins you into those thoughts of, where am I today? What got me here? What am I grateful for? And so maybe that's an activity to do, and I think whoever does it will realize that it really spins you into a really positive mindset.
I'm sure it does. I know every time I get on the phone and I chat with you, sometimes somewhat randomly, it always brightens my day. So I really appreciate you taking time today and sharing the story. It's obviously, as I say, a heartbreaking story, but with such an uplifting message to it that it's really worth hearing and worth sharing. So, as difficult as it can be to kind of relive some of the more difficult parts of the past, I think it's really something that we all thank you for, that you were willing to do this for us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the AAOS Now podcast, part of the AAOS Bone Beat Orthopedic podcast channel. Production and editing provided by MK Quinn Media. Don't miss out on future episodes of the AAOS Now podcast. Bookmark our page, aaos.org/AAOS-now-podcast. Listen to new and past episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the Health Podcast Network, and watch video versions of every episode on the AAOS Now podcast YouTube channel.